Gunfire tore through a quiet road outside Paris on a summer evening in 1962. 12 bullets, one tire. A vehicle should have spun off that road and killed everyone inside it. Instead, it kept moving, riding low on three wheels and one blown one, carrying French President Charles de Gaulle clear of the ambush. That machine looked strange, a beak-like nose, a spine of glass, a ride that seemed to breathe. Engineers had built something the public once dismissed as too odd to matter. This is the story of the Citroën DS. Drop a comment. Would you have trusted something this unusual with your life? 7 centimeters. That's how far a Citroën DS could lift its own body off the ground, settling itself level no matter how much weight sat inside it. No other production car in the world could do that in 1955. Buyers who'd only ever driven something that thumped over every pothole had no framework for what they were feeling the first time they rode in one. Why would a car company build something this radical for ordinary drivers instead of a racetrack? France, still rebuilding after the war, wanted proof that its industry could lead again, not just recover. A Renault or a Peugeot could get a family to work. Citroën wanted to build something that made the rest of the world stop and look. Inside Citroën's Paris studios in the early 1950s, 3 very different men were chasing that ambition from 3 very different directions. André Lefebvre, the project's lead engineer, had spent decades obsessed with ride comfort, convinced that a car's suspension mattered more than its horsepower ever could. Paul Magès worked beside him, refining a hydraulic system so the car could adjust its own height, its own brakes, even its own steering assist, all through pressurized fluid instead of mechanical linkage. Flaminio Bertoni, the sculptor turned designer, shaped a body that looked like nothing else on French roads, long, low, and curved, like something built to slip through weather rather than fight it. Every other manufacturer in Europe still built cars that jolted and complained over rough pavement, treating discomfort as simply the price of driving. Citroën's team refused to accept that as inevitable. They believed a road's imperfections shouldn't reach the passengers sitting above it, and they spent years building a suspension system stubborn enough to prove that belief correct. Push down on a DS's fender, and something happens that no 1950s driver had ever seen a car do before. The body sinks under your hand, then rises smoothly back to its exact original height the moment you let go. No bounce, no settling, no mechanical protest. Hydraulic fluid did that work quietly, constantly, adjusting pressure through a central system that also ran the brakes and the power steering. One fluid, one pump, an entire car breathing in sync with the road beneath it. Wrapped around that hydraulic heart sat a body shaped with genuine aerodynamic intent, cutting through air at a drag figure close to 0.38. A number some family sedans still can't match 7 decades later. Bertoni's team tested models in wind tunnels usually reserved for aircraft research, chasing a shape that would slice through highway speeds instead of shoving air out of its way. The result looked less like a sedan and more like something that had wandered in from an entirely different decade. Behind that shape sat brakes most manufacturers wouldn't offer for another 10 years. Disc brakes on all 4 wheels, powered by the same hydraulic system running the suspension, stopped the DS with a confidence drum brakes, simply couldn't match its speed. Engineers who understood what sat underneath this car recognized genius immediately. Journalists who drove it away from the 1955 Paris Motor Show placed orders within hours, some reportedly before they'd even finished the test drive. None of this mattered yet to a mechanic standing in a rain-soaked garage a year later, staring at a hydraulic system unlike anything his training had prepared him for. Brilliance on a test track was one thing. Convincing an entire continent of skeptical repair shops to trust fluid instead of steel was about to become a very different fight. Rain hammered the roof of a garage outside London in 1957, and a mechanic stood over an open Citroën engine bay, with no idea where to even begin. He'd trained on carburetors and drum brakes, on systems he could see and touch and understand with a wrench. What sat in front of him ran on pressurized fluid, sealed lines, and a logic borrowed more from aviation than from anything Ford or Austin had ever built. He closed the hood, apologized to the owner, and told her to find someone else. That scene repeated itself across garages in Britain, Germany, and beyond throughout the DS's early years. Ordinary mechanics, the backbone of any car's reputation, had no training and often no interest in learning a system this unfamiliar. Some refused outright, others attempted repairs without understanding the hydraulics fully, occasionally making the problem worse instead of better. Word spread through owner circles the way bad reputations always do, quickly, and with exaggeration attached at every retelling. Insurance companies reacted with their own version of suspicion. Underwriters who couldn't easily price the risk of a self-leveling suspension system simply charged more for it, treating innovation as a liability rather than an asset. A car built to protect its passengers better than almost anything else on the road somehow became more expensive to insure than machines with a fraction of its engineering. For buyers weighing a purchase, that contradiction landed hard. Rival manufacturers noticed the opening and took it. Mercedes and BMW built their reputations on mechanical simplicity buyers could trust, and their sales teams leaned into every DS horror story that crossed their path. A car this advanced, competitors argued, was a car built to strand you. Advertisements never named Citroën directly, but the message reached showroom floors clearly enough. Strange had become a word used against the DS, not in its favor. If you're the kind of person who roots for the underdog nobody else believed in yet, stick with this one, because what happens next is exactly why that belief eventually paid off. Owners who stuck with the DS through those uncertain years described something close to loyalty forged under pressure. A retired schoolteacher from Lyon, interviewed decades later for a French motoring retrospective, recalled driving her DS through a flooded country road that would have swallowed any lesser car whole. The suspension simply adjusted, lifted, and carried her through without complaint. She kept that car for 11 years, defending it at every dinner party where someone brought up its reputation for trouble. Specialist mechanics slowly emerged to fill the gap ordinary garages refused to close. A handful of technicians across Europe took the time to actually learn the hydraulic system Mages had designed, building reputations of their own as the only people within 100 kilometers who could service a DS properly. Owners drove hours out of their way just to reach one, grateful for a mechanic willing to trust fluid over habit. That gap between admiration and accessibility defined the DS for most of its first decade on the road. People who understood it loved it fiercely. People who didn't dismissed it just as fiercely. And for a car built to lead an entire industry forward, being misunderstood by the very people meant to maintain it felt like its own kind of quiet punishment. None of that distrust changed what the engineering had already proven on a rain-slicked road outside Paris in 1962, and it certainly didn't stop other manufacturers from watching closely. One of them, in particular, was about to do something no rival had done before, pay Citroën directly for the right to build the same system into cars, carrying one of the most respected badges in the world. Crewe, England, 1965. Engineers at Rolls-Royce faced a problem their own suspension designs couldn't solve, a ride smooth enough to match the brand's reputation for effortless comfort, no matter the road beneath it. Rather than build a rival system from scratch, they did something almost no major manufacturer had done before. They asked Citroën for permission to use its own. Licensing an idea from a French mass-market manufacturer wasn't exactly comfortable for a company that prized its own engineering pedigree above almost everything else. Yet the math was simple enough for Rolls-Royce's board to accept without much argument. Citroën's hydropneumatic system already solved the exact problem their engineers had spent years chasing unsuccessfully. Paying for proven genius cost less, in the end, than reinventing it poorly. By 1965, Rolls-Royce's Silver Shadow rolled off the line with a hydraulic braking and leveling system built directly on Citroen's patented technology, openly credited in the company's own engineering documentation. This wasn't quiet imitation. It was a formal agreement, acknowledged on paper, between a French innovator and one of the most conservative luxury badges on earth. For a car dismissed by British showrooms a decade earlier as too strange to trust, that acknowledgement carried real weight. Word of the arrangement spread through the industry quickly, and it changed how engineers elsewhere talked about hydropneumatic suspension entirely. What had once sounded like an eccentric French experiment now carried the validation of a manufacturer known for refusing anything less than the very best available. Skepticism that had followed the DS through garages and insurance offices for a decade started, slowly, to soften. Mercedes followed a different path toward the same conclusion years later, developing its own self-leveling air suspension for flagship sedans through the 1990s and beyond. Company engineers never denied the lineage of the concept, crediting hydropneumatic principles first proven on French roads decades earlier as a genuine influence on their own research. Citroën's strangeness had become an industry reference point rather than a punchline. Consider what actually happened here. A system dismissed as too unusual for ordinary drivers ended up underneath one of the most respected luxury badges in the world, credited openly rather than buried or denied. That distinction matters more than it might first appear. Plenty of forgotten innovations get quietly absorbed by bigger rivals who erase the smaller name behind them. The DS's suspension took the opposite path entirely, acknowledged, licensed, and eventually imitated by name rather than in secret. Modern luxury cars still carry that lineage today, even where the badge on the trunk has nothing to do with France. Adaptive air suspension, self-leveling ride height, hydraulic systems that read a road surface and adjust before a passenger ever feels a bump. Every one of these features traces its earliest working proof back to a car mocked at its own launch for looking too much like the future. Engineers who scoffed at that beak-like nose in 1955 spent the next several decades quietly building toward the exact same idea. That's the real inheritance sitting underneath the DS's reputation, not a car that failed and got forgotten. A car too strange for its own decade, proven right by every luxury manufacturer that eventually came asking how it worked. That same suspension once kept a president alive on a bullet-riddled road outside Paris. Decades later, it was still riding quietly under one of the most expensive badges on earth. The car once called too strange to succeed became the blueprint nobody could ignore. Which forgotten design deserves this same second look? Drop your pick below, then subscribe.